Officer Lopez, could you tell the court what you do for a living? What qualifies you to serve East Flamingo's SWAT division? And what were you doing the night of August 14th? Would you recognize an image of that tip if you saw it in court today? Officer, I'm looking at Exhibit A, which purports to depict that tip you received. Is this a fair and accurate copy of what came in at 9:08 on August 14th? The prosecution moves Exhibit A into evidence. Now, officer, you mentioned a response to this tip. What did that response entail? Were you armed? So as you and your armed SWAT team entered the residence, what happened next? What happened after you yelled freeze at the man at the top of the stairs? And what did your investigation reveal? Were you able to verify the identity of the man who fell? Who was it? What did you do after reviving Mr. Smith? And what information did you gather from that interview? What did you do after hearing about the defendant's death threat? Were you able to meet the defendant at her apartment? What did you learn from the defendant? Were you able to verify the location of the phone of which the tip was sent from? Could you explain how you know the defendant had access to that tip? How do you know that the defendant had access to the tip at that time? So after confirming that the defendant had access to that phone, what did you do next? No further questions. Hello, Mr. Patterson. I want to understand your relationship with the defendant. You called the defendant a friend, right? Spent some time working with him to bully Sawyer Smith online. You can recall a time when the defendant came up with an idea to create a fake account named Hayden Carlton, right? The purpose of this account was to teach Mr. Smith a lesson in humility, right? And you vetted every single mean or petty comment before it was posted? Because you thought the defendant's idea to set Mr. Smith up on a fake date was brilliant, right? You thought lying to Mr. Smith online was hilarious? Well, let's fast forward a bit. You're aware of the comment that the defendant left on Sawyer Smith's post on August 14th, right? But you think it was just a harmless joke, don't you? Specifically, Mr. Patterson, you tell us your friend's words, quote, "I'm going to get you for this. I hate you. You deserve to die. When you're dead, no one will even miss you. Watch your back, Sawyer. I'm coming for you." You think that was just a harmless joke? Well, let's fast forward to the night of August 14th. Now, you and the defendant were upstairs between 9 and 9:15 p.m., right? And Cameron Holmes' phone was plugged in and charging on a table not so far from the defendant, right? And Mr. Patterson, you weren't speaking with the defendant at 9:08 p.m., were you? Nah, you were on the phone talking to your sister, right? You were a little distracted on that call, weren't you? And you'd say that you never saw Reagan touch Cameron's phone even a single time during the entire night. So if the defendant were to admit that they did use that phone even once, you'd have to admit that you didn't see the whole picture of what was going on, right? No further questions. Good evening, Dr. Williams. Now, you'd say there's not enough evidence to definitively determine who wrote that false tip, right? If I said the only two potential authors were Mr. Holmes and the defendant, you'd say I'm actually making a pretty large assumption, right? But Dr. Williams, you reviewed every witness statement before taking the stand today, right? And you used the facts in those statements to determine whether or not your analysis was the truth. So you learned from Marlo Patterson's statement that Mr. Holmes and the defendant were the only two upstairs during the time that this tip was sent, right? You acknowledged from Cameron Holmes' statement that Mr. Holmes and the defendant were the only two people upstairs when this tip was sent. And you learned from the defendant's own statement that Mr. Holmes and the defendant herself were the only two upstairs when the tip was sent, right? So in other words, even though only 3 people in that apartment say that it could only have been Mr. Holmes or Miss Klein, you'd still say it could have been anybody on the face of the planet, right? Well, let's talk about your analysis. Now, I'm looking at Exhibit D, your report. You'd agree that the word heart appeared in the false tip, right? And there's instances of it in 19 of the defendant's messages. And it only appears twice in the writings of Cameron Holmes, right? Similarly, words like value are present in the false tip. Now, this is observable in 13 cases of the defendant's writings, right? But never once in Cameron Holmes' writings, right? Finally, you acknowledge that the expression I figure appears in the false tip. Now, I'm looking for a number here, Dr. Williams. How many times did the expression I figure appear in the writings of Reagan Klein? And how many times did it appear in the writings that you studied of Cameron Holmes? No further questions. Hello, Dr. Williams. Could you tell the court what you do for a living? And what qualifies you for that position? Do you have a lot of experience in forensic investigation? What experience? Doctor, what's author verification? So let's talk about how you piece together that puzzle. Based on your conclusions on the facts, did you and the prosecution's expert have any major areas of disagreement? So let's take those two areas one by one. First, whose writing style is more consistent with the false tips? Now, what did Dr. Chung conclude? Was he able to reach this conclusion to a degree of professional certainty? What's your response to this uncertain conclusion? Well, why is that, Doctor? May I approach opposing counsel and the witness in turn with Exhibit D, Dr. Williams' distinctive vocabulary choices table? Doctor, do you recognize this? What can you tell us about the vocabulary choices that you studied in this table? What do you mean? Wouldn't that indicate that the author was Miss Klein? Why is that? Did you find any evidence that indicated that Cameron Holmes was a more consistent author? Can you explain? Next, let's talk about who could have potentially framed my client in writing this tip. What did the prosecution's expert conclude? And what's your response, Dr. Williams? Can you explain? So based on everything you reviewed, who wrote this false tip? No further questions. Hello, Dr. Williams. Could you tell the court what you do for a living? And what qualifies you for that position? Do you have a lot of experience in forensic investigation? What experience? Doctor, what's author verification? So let's talk about how you piece together that puzzle. Based on your conclusions on the facts, did you and the prosecution's expert have any major areas of disagreement? So let's take those two areas one by one. First, whose writing style is more consistent with the false tips? Now, what did Dr. Chung conclude? Was he able to reach this conclusion to a degree of professional certainty? What's your response to this uncertain conclusion? Well, why is that, Doctor? May I approach opposing counsel and the witness in turn with Exhibit D, Dr. Williams' distinctive vocabulary choices table? Doctor, do you recognize this? What can you tell us about the vocabulary choices that you studied in this table? What do you mean? Wouldn't that indicate that the author was Miss Klein? Why is that? Did you find any evidence that indicated that Cameron Holmes was a more consistent author? Can you explain? Next, let's talk about who could have potentially framed my client in writing this tip. What did the prosecution's expert conclude? And what's your response, Dr. Williams? Can you explain? So based on everything you reviewed, who wrote this false tip? No further questions. Mr. Kolostrian, could you tell the court what you do for a living? What's Hennessy's? Are you familiar with Reagan Klein? How do you know Miss Klein? Why'd you have to fire Miss Klein, Mr. Kolostrian? How'd you react to hearing about this? What's the riot act, Mr. Kolostrian? Did you actually mean to take any legal action against Miss Klein? Well, then why'd you imply that you would? And what was Reagan Klein's immediate reaction to being fired? Well, why'd you regret it? Let's talk about your observations of Reagan Klein in the workplace. How often did you see or interact with Sawyer Smith? Did they ever get into any sort of fight? Well, let's focus on a specific incident of sending false tips to the police. Did you ever have to discuss this crime with your employees? And under what circumstances did you have to discuss this terrible crime? And what was Reagan Klein's reaction to hearing about this situation? How did Cameron Holmes react to this swatting incident on the news? No further questions. Dr. Chung, let's talk about what your analysis revealed. Now, you acknowledge the possibility that somebody may have framed my client to make it look as if she wrote a false tip, right? In order to explore that possibility, you looked at Marlo Patterson's witness statement, and you learned from Marlo Patterson that Cameron Holmes had expressed an interest in removing my client from the picture, right? You're aware that Cameron Holmes and my client shared access to a social media account regularly, right? And this would have given Cameron Holmes ample opportunities to study my client's unique writing style. And you think it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Cameron Holmes to have framed my client to make it look like she wrote that false tip when she really didn't, right? Doctor, I want to talk to you about professional certainty. Can you rule out Cameron Holmes as the author of that tip to a degree of professional certainty? Well, let's look at the evidence. I'm looking at Exhibit C, your summative report. Now, you acknowledge that whole word number homophone substitutions exist in the false tip, right? The word to was replaced by the letter to a few times. And in 9 of the cases you studied of Cameron Holmes' writings, you see this linguistic mannerism, right? But in none of my client's writings do you ever observe this. Next, on whole word letter homophone substitutions. These are present in the false tip too, right? The word you, normally spelled Y-O-U, is replaced by just the letter U. And you studied this in 9 cases of Cameron Holmes' writings, correct? But only ever twice in my client's writings. Now, Dr. Chung, you acknowledge that a few word shortenings also exist in the false tip, right? The word please is spelled P-L-Z instead of its normal way. Dr. Chung, I'm looking for a number here specifically. How many times did you observe word shortenings in Cameron Holmes' writings that you studied? And Dr. Chung, how many times did you observe them in Reagan Klein's writings? No further questions. Hello, officer. You acknowledge that the phone that sent the false tip didn't belong to my client, right? It actually belonged to Cameron Holmes. You spoke with Cameron Holmes about an alibi they had, right? And their excuse was they were downstairs at 9:08 p.m. picking up a pizza, right? However, officer, you reviewed a pizza delivery receipt, didn't you? And it actually says that that pizza was delivered at 9:02 p.m., right? Cameron Holmes never responded to this direct contradiction in their alibi, right? Let's talk about some other things you may not have known when you chose to arrest my client on August 14th. Were you aware that no one had claimed to have seen my client typing that false tip? You're aware that no one saw my client send that false tip, right? In fact, you know that the only person who claims to have seen Miss Klein even touch the phone that night was Cameron Holmes, right? Were you aware that Cameron Holmes has made statements concerning removing my client from the picture? But Officer Lopez, your unit never conducted a thorough investigation into Cameron Holmes, did they? No further questions.